It is a complicated process. It's not as if you can simply blame one side or another. It's not a black and white dynamic that we are seeing. But I think what has occurred is that in the months, maybe even the years leading up to the invasion of the Ukraine, it seems to me that Europe has been pushed out of the scene. The European Union hasn't played very much of a role in all the different negotiations. And what has happened is that, on the one hand, the United States has had this policy that communicates mixed messages. On the one hand, the United States, unfortunately, has signaled the idea that it might be possible for Ukraine to join NATO, thereby making the Russians feel a little bit insecure, making the Russians feel that their security concerns were not being taken seriously by the American president, and at the same time as encouraging the Ukrainians to think that somehow this might be a possibility, that there might be a new regime of cooperation between the West and the Ukraine, integrating the Ukraine much more into the Western political sphere. Biden was also making very, very clear that when push comes to shove, they wouldn't really do very much to defend the Ukraine militarily, and more or less indicating that there is a red line, but when the Russians cross the red line, it will not be met with any serious force by NATO, by the NATO alliance or the United States. So on the one hand, you had that, and at the same time, what you had was, I think, a situation where Russia felt that the West was divided. Russia felt that they weren't being very serious in seeing through the kind of provocations that they felt was being targeted at them. I think especially after Afghanistan and the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan, they must have concluded that there was an opportunity there.
Jamie Shea, let's talk about your specialist subject, NATO. Should NATO have taken President Putin's security concerns about expansion more seriously?
Well, Stephen, I think NATO genuinely did. And of course, I lived a lot of this period directly with a front seat at NATO headquarters. For example, after NATO began its enlargement, it explicitly told the Russians that under peaceful circumstances in Europe, it wouldn't put combat troops or nuclear weapons or infrastructure on the territory of the new member states. So this was really about Eastern Europe moving west rather than about NATO in a military sense moving east. And I remember for many years, countries in Central and Eastern Europe that had just joined NATO used to come to my office and complain that they weren't getting the American tanks or the F-16s that they were expecting. NATO deliberately tried to indicate to Moscow that it wasn't threatening its security interests. We had a period where we enlarged NATO, and President Putin came regularly to NATO summit meetings. We had a NATO-Russia council. We met frequently and cooperated with the Russians in places like Afghanistan or fighting pirates in the Gulf of Aden. And I think that we also need to remember that Ukraine's wish to join NATO only really became active after 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and the Ukrainians, fearing a threat from Russia, then changed their constitution to open the perspective of NATO membership. So in a way, President Putin is like the sort of pyrotechnic firefighter who causes the problems.
Jamie, I think Frank is also saying that Moscow detected a lack of Western resolve.
I agree with Frank on that. I definitely think that Putin did see the Trump years as implying that the United States was no longer committed to NATO. I also agree with Frank that Putin probably thought that the Europeans were so dependent upon Russian gas and oil or Russian money that they would never rally towards any serious sanctions. And I think probably he's been surprised by the draconian nature of the sanctions as well. But what Putin should have realized, of course, is that Afghanistan is vastly different from NATO's core mission of collective defense. Many allies saw Afghanistan as a voluntary mission where they didn't have to go. But when it comes to collective defense, everybody feels they're very much in the same boat.
Do you think Mr. Putin will have been surprised by the turnaround and a resolve that has been shown by the West?
I think so. I think there was a very clear perception on the part of Putin and his colleagues that the West was divided, that the West was in a sense not in a position to kind of respond to his assault on the Ukraine with any serious force, and must have been shocked by the way in which sanctions were immediately imposed. Having said that, I would say that it's still not the case that the unity has been cemented in a way that is absolutely solid. I think there are still hesitancy on the part of different NATO members in the way that they are responding to Russia. For example, I think the Germans, are still very reluctant to cut down or reduce and substantially reduce their energy dependence upon Russia. So there's still the element of hesitancy there. And I think that so long as America and so long as NATO, in a sense, leave the military option off the table, that unity will not be seriously tested, because I think it's one thing to unite on providing relief aid for refugees, and it's one thing to put sanctions on individual oligarchs. It's quite another thing to take that next step in a unified way against the threat.
And Jamie, we all thought, speaking collectively, that the Cold War was over. But in fact, this may well have started a new geopolitical Cold War. And I'm thinking about what the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, who in the last few days said that in order to find a solution, you need to abandon the Cold War mentality. Is that right? Do we have to abandon a Cold War mentality? And how much of NATO's existence is down to a Cold War mentality?
Well, I certainly feel that we are going to obviously be in a much more confrontational posture with Russia. I think that is just the reality, Stephen, that's going to result from this crisis. I mean, Russia clearly has made it, Putin has said many times that it's not happy with NATO. It's not just NATO enlargement that Putin is against, it's NATO per se, that he still regards as an adversary. Putin has made it clear that he wants not simply to bring Ukraine back into the Russian fold, but to overturn the entire European security order. I mean, he's made demands on NATO to stop defending half of its membership, which would clearly sort of be tantamount to the disintegration of NATO per se.
Did he have legitimate security
has been
concerns?
Challenging the West in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere. So I think we have to wake up to the fact that we have a Russia problem, and it's going to take a long time. And I agree with Frank in the sense that we're going to have to stay united, not just for the short term, but the long haul, before we are able to sort of deal effectively with Russia. So certain aspects of Cold War containment, yes, I think are going to have to come back.
Did he have legitimate concerns about security on his borders?
Yes.
Well, again, if you look at the situation before Putin invaded Ukraine, NATO had only 4,000 troops. I mean, that's hardly a serious combat force to challenge Russia. As a tripwire stationed in the Baltic states and in Poland, multinational battalions, we had, NATO, very few forces in the Black Sea area, and those forces were rotational. They weren't permanent, and they weren't heavily armed either. With little air support. So I don't think Putin, looking out, seeing Finland and Sweden still outside NATO, would have thought that NATO posed any kind of military threat.
Well, I think that Jamie is right when he said earlier on about how NATO went out of its way not to put pressure on Russia. And certainly until the Maidan Revolution, there was a kind of understanding that NATO wasn't going to expand into Ukraine, wasn't going to create any kind of pressure on Russia. I think laterally that has changed. I think one of the things that has occurred in recent years is that the State Department in the United States has become much more ambivalent about some of these promises that were made in the past. I think it's very tragic and unfortunate that Russia and the Ukraine became entwined in American domestic politics during the Trump years and even now, to the point at which a lot of policymakers failed to make a distinction between geopolitical interests and what was taking place domestically in Washington. And I think that to some extent there's a sense in which Russian insecurity is understandable in light of some of the changing postures that develop within the United States in particular. And I think that's That doesn't excuse anything in terms of the invasion of the Ukraine, but I think it does provide a context as to why it is that the balance of power situation unraveled so fast in recent months.
Okay, let's talk about the geopolitics and the possibility of the change in geopolitics because of the invasion. As you both know, Sergei Lavrov, he's an extremely experienced foreign secretary, Russian foreign minister, and he said if the West decides to drop a new Iron Curtain on Russia, Russia won't be too worried. He says they'll just look for development opportunities elsewhere. Now, what do you think that says about the sanctions and the pressure that's being brought to bear on Russia in the last few weeks, and how will it change the geopolitics? First of all, Frank, and then Jamie.
I think there's an element of bluffing there because the idea that somehow Russia is going to move entirely eastwards and maybe forge a new relationship with China is not something that is realistic in the long run. And of course, Russia can take a lot of punishment in terms of sanctions. It's not a democratically accountable system where public pressure has got the same role as here in the West. But I do think that what's been happening by the Russian sort of oligarchy is an attempt to kind of create the impression that they're not particularly bothered by anything that's been thrown at them. They can easily readjust and redeploy their resources elsewhere. I think that is just merely an element of bluffing to kind of create the conditions where they can negotiate maybe later on this basis.
All right, Jamie, just rhetoric?
Well, I totally agree with Frank on that. I think the bluster is part of the Kremlin's playbook of trying to appear unconcerned and nonchalant. But Russia it sends well over 50% of its oil and gas to the West, even oil to the United States, which the Americans are now trying to shut down. And China is not going to be able to substitute entirely for the finance, the energy revenues, the technology that Russia is going to be losing as a result of sanctions. The Russian oligarchs don't have their money in renminbi in banks in Beijing. They have that money in euros and pounds and dollars in the West. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, state councillor, has spoken about the need to respect the territorial sovereignty of states. I think that Beijing will be a bit hesitant about being dragged in to every piece of reckless adventurism by Putin. It wants to be a responsible international actor.
I just want to get personal for my last question to both of you. American officials say they're very worried about Mr. Putin's state of mind. They say he's isolated. They say he's out of touch. And if he is prone, as the American officials are alleging, if he is prone to miscalculation, has the use of nuclear weapons become conceivable? Jamie first.
Well, I think a lot of it is bluster. As Frank was saying earlier, designed to intimidate us, to frighten us. I mean, President Putin has been waving the nuclear weapon around for years. He even mentioned nuclear strikes when he gave a speech to a group of Russian Boy Scouts a couple of years ago. So this is not new. And I think the calm, measured way in which the West has responded, the fact that the United States this week has cancelled ballistic missile tests so that there could be no misreading of Western restraint is the right way to go.
I am a little bit worried, but maybe that's because I'm an East European by birth, and I've seen how these things can very easily get out of hand. And we should be a little bit concerned that the idea of a nuclear war is not something that is merely a dystopian vision that's entirely confined to Hollywood films.
Frank Furedi and Jamie Shea, thank you both very much for joining us on The Agenda.